The lesson that I have been assigned involves Roy Cogdill as well as a number of other preachers who were like-minded as he was, and what we might refer to as the institutional problems that began to emerge in the churches of Christ in the mid-1950s. And they continued to spiral out of control for a number of years. They, of course, still exist today, but the storm has quietened much today as opposed to what was going on in the last 25 years. Roy Cogdill was born on the 24th of April in 1907 in the town of Hobart, Oklahoma. His father was killed in an industrial accident in April of 1915, and Roy was just one day past his 8th birthday when his father was buried. Sometime later, young Roy ran away from home with a neighbor, in the company of a neighbor, a school companion who actually came from an alcoholic family, not a very good reputation as a young man. And as a result, that upset his mother to a great degree, and she soon realized that if she was to salvage the boy, she had to do something positive in his life that would cause him to consider his actions then as well as later on. She realized the difficulty of raising a son all by herself, and she mortgaged the only thing she really had, which was her house, the house they lived in order to get enough money to send him away to Western Oklahoma Christian College that was located about 22 miles away in Cardell, Oklahoma. After graduating from high school, Roy went to Abilene Christian College as a freshman at the age of 16, and he soon became class president and was known as an outstanding debater in ACC. However, he left ACC before graduating there and re-enrolled in Cardell, intending at some point to attend Southern Methodist University in Dallas. These plans, however, failed and paled into somewhat an insignificant state when his preaching began to grow among the churches throughout Texas and Oklahoma and other places, and he soon was called for so many meetings that he really didn't have time for college at that time. During the late 20s and the early 30s, he became friends with Foy E. Wallace Jr., and they began a friendship that was to last for a long, long time. They, in many ways, were like-minded. They not only enjoyed the association with one another, but they found themselves agreeing on many of the Bible topics that confronted the churches of that day. However, in 1931, Roy Cogdill enrolled in the Jefferson Law School in Dallas. It's interesting that among his professors at that law school was Sarah Hughes, the same Sarah Hughes that ministered the oath of office to Lyndon Johnson when he became president after the assassination of Kennedy. Well, he continued his studies in law, eventually graduating, and during that period of time, he shared a radio program with W.L. Oliphant on KRLD out of Dallas, and they preached Sunday about. One Sunday Roy would preach, one Sunday W.L. Oliphant would preach. Now, Oliphant was a very famous preacher during that period of time. There has been since a book of his sermons published several years ago, and he also printed the sermons that he preached on a weekly basis, and they were mailed out to anybody that wanted them. It came out in little booklet form. But both the men were very famous, very outstanding as preachers of the gospel during that period of time. He conducted his first debate in Carnegie, Oklahoma, which happened to be on the subject of instrumental music. In 1938, he published his first book, The New Testament Church. It's still one of the best-selling books among churches of Christ today. And if you're a young man and you don't have a copy of The New Testament Church by Roy Cogdill, you need one. They're not a very expensive booklet, but I can tell you it's one of the finest books you'll ever buy. And if you study, if you read and you study it, and you commit to memory some of the things that are in that book, it will serve you well as long as you live. It was during this particular year that he began his law practice in Dallas in the firm of Jack Johns, who would become later the general counsel for a small potato company which grew to be the Frito-Lay Company. While practicing law, Roy Cogdill obtained on a client's behalf what was at that time the largest monetary judgment awarded by any Dallas court. And so he was a very successful lawyer, and obviously during that period of time became rather famous, I suppose you could say, among a lot of people. At one point in his law career, he was called to Washington, D.C. to serve as a consultant for the United States government. The reason, of course, was no doubt his association, which, by the way, was one of his clients, the Folgers Coffee Company. And, of course, they imported coffee beans from South America and places like that. And Roy Cogdill obtained a great deal of knowledge about dealing with people from that place. He was a very successful legal representative for the Folgers Coffee Company. He also consulted with the highest ranking officials of the Pentagon on several different occasions, and on one occasion he even consulted with the Supreme Court. And so Roy Cogdill was a very successful lawyer, no question about that. When he quit the practice of law, and I found this, I didn't know this, I found it very interesting, he moved to Springfield, Missouri, and started work with the South National Church of Christ. They thought they had a real catch on their hands when they got Roy Cogdill, because he was very famous at that time already. He only stayed 9 months, and he got a call from Houston to move down there and work with one of the congregations in Houston, which he did. In time, he was conducting meetings throughout the United States and was in demand not only as a speaker, but a debater and a writer. His debates with Guy and Woods on cooperative works stand as classics in the field. If any young preacher here tonight does not have the Cogdill-Woods debate, I strongly advise you buy it and you read it. It is one of the great debates of all time, at least in my opinion. There were 2 of them, by the way. One of them was published, however. Guy and Woods was also a lawyer. And so you have 2 lawyers going head to head, as well as 2 preachers of the gospel. And in this debate, or in these debates, it was designed to discuss the cooperative works that were so popular among the churches at that particular time. Well, after their debates, neither of which actually resolved the issues between them, there were a number of other debates that were held during this period of time. In the first half of the 20th century, the churches of Christ were on the move. It was really a thrilling time in many ways. The gospel was being preached in New Testament form so far as obedience to the gospel was concerned. And far and wide, men were going throughout the world proclaiming the message of salvation. Such names as Foye Wallace Jr., N.B. Hardeman, G.C. Brewer, J.D. Tant, Joe Warlick, H. Leo Bowles, and many others were commonly known by vast numbers of Christians. Prior to that time, there was no division over the works that eventually would create a division within the churches of Christ. Some sources place the number of Christians in 1926 at around 500,000 in America. Radio programs over WLAC out of Nashville and KRLD in Dallas were reaching literally thousands of people. And such names as Cogdill and Oliphant became household names. Everybody listened to the radio. No television in those days to amount to anything at all, if any at all. And so everybody tuned into the radio. The Dallas-Fort Worth area really was full of churches of Christ, even at that time. Hundreds of people had obeyed the gospel and continued to obey the gospel during their meetings. Consequently, they looked forward to these radio programs, and these 2 men both were not only outstanding speakers, but in their own right, they were certainly great exponents of what they believed to be the truth. During this time frame, however, various parachurch organizations were also growing. Not only was the church expanding and not only was preaching going on in this country and even in some foreign countries, David Lipscomb College, Harding College, Pepperdine in California were becoming known nationwide. The colleges were growing, and as the colleges grew and more people attended those colleges and then later entered the preaching field, obviously they came to the front. At that time also, orphans' homes were beginning to be established and they were beginning to grow. Tennessee Orphan Home, 1909. Potter in 1914 in the state of Kentucky, Bowles in 1927 in Texas, and Tipton in Oklahoma in 1928. These orphans' homes demanded money. They had to have money to exist. They had to have money to operate. These colleges needed money to operate, and you might well discover, you might well guess where they were going to get the money. They were going to try to get the money from the churches. That's where the money would come from to allow them to grow and actually become impressive. Gospel meetings were often great events during that period of time with outstanding results. It was during this time frame that N.B. Hardeman preached those famous sermons in Nashville, Tennessee, where each night from 8,000 to 10,000 people gathered to hear him preach the gospel. G.K. Wallace, in commenting on the preaching during those days, said, most of the baptisms were from denominations. Denominational people, however, do not come these days to our meetings, and if they did, they would not, in most places, hear anything that would lead them out of false doctrine. Well, that was kind of a sad commentary, but it was true because the preaching had degenerated during this period of time, at least when G.K. Wallace was writing. And instead of preaching the pure and simple gospel of Jesus Christ, men were preaching other things. And it interfered, of course, with the results that came about. There were a number of other factors, however, that worked. And these factors all began to emerge and contrive to bring about the result of the greatest division since the introduction of instrumental music that occurred in the churches of Christ. At the Abilene Christian College lectures in 1938, G.C. Brewer was understood by many to say, and I quote, "When a church does not have Abilene Christian College in their budget, they have the wrong preacher." In other words, we need to put the college in the budget. We need to have churches sending money to the colleges. 10 years later, N.B. Hardeman and others began to push to get churches to support the colleges from their treasuries. Now we're talking about men, big name men, when you talk about Hardeman, when you talk about Brewer. You're talking about people that had a vast area of influence all over their brotherhood. And these men were saying, we've got to put the colleges in the budget. We've got to put these orphans' homes in the budget. We've got to support them. And so churches everywhere begin to take that into account. In 1939, at the Abilene Christian College lectures, Guy N. Woods gave a warning that turned out to be quite prophetic. Now this is rather strange, because at this particular time, Woods said, and I quote, "The ship of Zion has floundered more than once on the sandbar of institutionalism. The tendency to organize is a characteristic of the age. On the theory that the end justifies the means, brethren have now scrupled to form organizations in the church to do the work of the church, the work the church was designed to do. All such organizations usurp the work of the church and are unnecessary and sinful." Now, this was in 1939. Woods was saying these things, these institutions are sinful. Now, it's strange that a few years later he would flip-flop and be on the other side and actually, in debate, try to defend these institutions. Later on, 1946, Woods also wrote in the annual lesson commentary, "It should be noted that there was no elaborate organization for the discharge of these charitable functions. The contributions were sent directly to the elders by the churches who raised the offerings. This is the New Testament method of functioning." Well, they soon left that principle. And after World War I, problems arose in the Churches of Christ over what was called the one-man missionary society. You remember, years before, the church had divided over missionary societies. However, instead of a full-blown society that was representative of that early period of time, there was a fellow over in Kentucky by the name of Don Carlos Janes, who had brethren sending, or churches sending him money. And he collected the money, and then he would send the money to the preachers. And that came out and was generally called the one-man missionary society. These promoters, however, were stopped by brethren who exposed the unscripturalness of that arrangement. During this time, this country entered the dark days of World War II. And during the war years, everything in America seemed to be at a standstill. Even religion and various other works that were involved in religious activity. With the end, however, of World War II and the return of the GIs from the war, the fervor of evangelism grew, especially among the churches of Christ. With good intentions, churches were inundated with appeals to support cooperative works in Germany, Italy, and Japan. And in order to support such works, money was garnered from churches all over the states and then sent to the work overseas. Now, these works were overseen by certain congregations in Tennessee and Texas, which assumed centralized control over the work done in these countries. In other words, there would be a congregation at some point in the United States, in the state of Tennessee or somewhere else, and churches from all over the United States would send them money. Then this church would take this money, being in control of this money, they would then send money over to Japan or Germany or Italy, wherever the work was being done. These works were overseen, as I said, by churches in Tennessee and in Texas. The Broadway Church out here at Lubbock, Texas, became a sponsoring church to evangelize Germany. The Union Avenue Church in Memphis, where a very outstanding preacher by the name of Guy N. Woods preached, became the sponsoring church to evangelize Japan. And so what these people would do, they would send out word to all the churches, we have a work in Japan, send us the money, we'll take care of your money, we'll dispense your money wherever it's needed in this foreign country. This was actually the beginning of the sponsoring church arrangement. It was a concept where scores of hundreds of churches would send their funds to one eldership, which then had the oversight of whatever work was in their sight. In time, however, some brethren began to have second thoughts about that kind of cooperative effort. It was involved, of course, with a number of the larger churches who had the means to advertise, to collect the money, and then dispense the money. Roy Cogdill, Luther Blackman, Yater Tant, W. Curtis Porter, James Adams, Cled Wallace, and others were forced by conscience to withdraw their support from these schemes and voice their concerns. And this is really where trouble began, because all of these men were men of name. They were recognized names. And when they started saying, you know, we're doing something we can't justify, we can't read in the Bible where any kind of a situation such as this ever existed. As a result, they began to debate the issues. Debates were held in Indianapolis, Indiana, Birmingham, Alabama, Abilene, Texas, Louisville, Kentucky, and other places. The controversies that developed over these schemes came to be full-blown in the decade of the 1950s. The decade of the 50s, historically speaking, was an interesting period among churches of Christ, especially in Texas. During the 1950s, I was growing up in Fort Worth. And in Fort Worth at that time, every Saturday, there was a huge listing in our Saturday paper of the churches of Christ. There were somewhere between 40 or 50 churches in the Fort Worth area at that particular time. Such preachers as Leroy Brownlow, Thomas Warren, Roy Deaver, Johnny Ramsey called Fort Worth their home at that time. And the big name preachers from all over the United States would come to Fort Worth and hold gospel meetings. They were regular in doing that. During that time frame, I was just graduating from college, graduating from high school, and I took every opportunity that I had to go listen to some of these preachers. It was during this time that I met and heard G.C. Brewer for the first time, the one who introduced individual cups in 1915 into the churches of Christ. George D. Hoff, Ruel Lemons, Foy Wallace Jr. These were outstanding names, and many of them were great pulpiteers. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But underlying much of their preaching were the ideas that were being circulated by opposing forces that were at work in the brotherhood at that time. On the surface, somebody like me going in and listening to them preach, I never would get the idea there was a problem, but there were grave problems. And those problems were growing by the month and by the year, because those churches that essentially were liberal and participating in these money-raising schemes were going on, ignoring the fact that there was significant opposition to what they were doing, and many preachers actually opposed what they were doing. The proliferation of human institutions and the sponsoring church arrangement were all clamoring for support, and that set the scene for conflict. The colleges, the orphans' homes, the homes for unwed mothers and things of that nature, they all wanted money. They had to have money in order to exist and survive. Well, about this time came one of the greatest efforts of all, a television broadcast that would reach the entire nation. There was, of course, the Lutheran Hour, there was the Catholic Hour, and voices were crying for the Church of Christ Hour. In other words, they wanted a national television program that could be heard in any town in the United States. The Fifth and Highland Church in Abilene, Texas, was the sponsoring church for the program. And in time, over 1,000 churches were sending money to Highland for the program. That was a lot of churches. They were getting a lot of money. And it took a lot of money to buy television time and produce the program. Many saw a problem, however, with a large church receiving funds from these small churches all over the United States. Added to the list of organizations asking for support were, as I've pointed out, homes for unwed mothers, homes for the aged, and orphan asylums that were spread throughout the United States. There were all kinds of works. They all had to have money. In order to get the money, they had to get it from the churches. The churches had to agree that somehow that was a work of the church. And since it was a work of the church, they would send their money to whatever church was sponsoring that work, going into their treasury. And they would also send to the organization, whatever it was, that would be the recipient of their money. Opposition soon began to appear in some of the religious journals. You can always count on, with the people that are opposed to this kind of thing, they're going to be heard. Foy Wallace was among the first to come out in opposition to these schemes, along with his brother Glenn Wallace. The Gospel Guardian, along with other papers, took up the fight in opposition to these additions. On the other side, in support of these movements, was the Gospel Advocate and the Firm Foundation. The Firm Foundation, of course, was published here in Austin, Texas. And it had originated in Texas many years before. The Advocate actually closed its pages to any opposing view. Guy N. Woods emerged as the champion of their cause. And I've already mentioned the Woods-Cogdill debates that resulted because of that. By the mid-1950s, churches started to divide. Prior to that time, there was no division, even though they were divided in mind and in argument and in practice. But then the churches actually began to divide. In November and December of 1954, B.C. Goodpasture, the publisher of the Gospel Advocate at that time in Nashville, Tennessee, spearheaded a movement to quarantine every preacher that opposed these works. In other words, Goodpasture was essentially saying, we're going to cut off anybody that doesn't agree with us. We're not going to allow them to preach in any of our churches. And if you opposed human institutions in the budget of the church, you immediately were cut off. Brethren who opposed these schemes were called, guess what? Antis. They were the antis. They were the people who were opposed to the schemes that were going on. The sponsoring church concept is one, and we need to understand this. The sponsoring church concept is one that tries to activate the church universal in a central organization by having many churches pool their funds under one eldership. In other words, it is designed to get people to send money from various parts of the country to one church. That money is pooled into that church's treasury, and then that church can carry on whatever work might be under consideration. The elders of the sponsoring church have assumed a work larger than the local congregation. It was a work of brotherhood proportions. It was not a work of Highland, just Highland. It was not a work of any one congregation. It was a work that was assumed by one congregation, but the money came from hundreds of congregations every week. There obviously is no evidence in the New Testament that any congregation did its work through another congregation. It's not there. You can't find anywhere in the New Testament where any congregation did its work through another congregation. And there is no evidence in the New Testament that any church ever oversaw work it could not support. You will not find a single church in the New Testament that oversaw any work they couldn't support. Well, the arguments advanced by the non-institutional brethren, I want to give you a number of these arguments, and they resonate, I believe, if we stop and seriously consider what is under consideration. First of all, it was their contention. Now I'm talking about the what we would call the conservative churches. They became known as the antis, opposed to what was going on. The ripples of division started out, I suppose, rather small, but it wasn't long until, as I said in the very beginning, this was the greatest division that had occurred in churches of Christ since the division over instrumental music in 1906. And it was what you would call a large nationwide division. It took it a while as the ripples began to spread out from the center. It took it a while to eventually have its effect, but with good pastor's intention of quarantining everybody from their pulpits who didn't agree with them. You know, soon you were, if you opposed these works, you were on the outside. And obviously, by the same token, the people who did oppose the works weren't going to invite a preacher in who actually contended for that particular type of work. And so first of all, these people who were called the antis, they believe that God has revealed in Scripture patterns to be followed in the work and worship of the church. They believe there's a pattern. You know, we believe that too about the communion. We believe that about the teaching service. We believe God gave us a pattern. And whatever the pattern is, the pattern has to be followed. They believed and they argued that there is a pattern for doing mission work. There is a pattern for preaching the gospel. There's a way for a congregation to send money to a preacher. But there is no example of a congregation sending money to another church who then supports the preacher out of a fund that has been created. They also believe that the authoritative patterns are expressed, that is in the New Testament, are expressed in terms of either generic or specific statements or commands, also through examples for churches to follow, and finally for necessary conclusions or implications. That was the foundation of the argumentation that they made. Is there an example of any church ever sending money to another church for that church to use in preaching the gospel? Collecting money from various churches in order to do that. That is, of course, what commonly came to be referred to as the sponsoring church. This church sponsored, and everybody sent their money to them. Thirdly, they argued that the generic statements or commands allow expedient ways of obeying, while specific directions are more restrictive and do not allow changes. Fourthly, they argued that the differences between general and specific instructions can be distinguished by common sense principles of interpretation. Difference between a generic command and a specific command, and you can tell the difference between the two because using certain principles of edification and interpretation, that becomes evident. Next, they said there is a difference in individual and church responsibilities in carrying out their roles in glorifying God. We all might have individual duties and responsibilities in some areas. The question is, does the church sustain the very same responsibilities in the same way? And next, that the church's treasury is to be used for the purpose of the edification of its members. Secondly, assisting saints who are in need. And thirdly, in supporting preachers in their proclamation of the gospel. And that's all. That's the only authorization there is for spending the Lord's money. Next, there is no authority in Scripture for human organizations or super church arrangements through which local churches may do their work. Now, a super church arrangement would be like Highland in Abilene, where they took charge of the Herald of Truth by taking money from churches all over the United States. They were saying there just simply is no authority in Scripture for that kind of an arrangement. They also argued that the church Jesus died to purchase is a spiritual institution and was not intended to provide for the recreational or social needs of its members, nor to be worldwide benevolent organizations. Now, from that day until this, we have seen the rise of gymnasiums in their church buildings, the rise of kitchens and all kinds of entertaining situations. These people were saying the Lord's money is not to be used that way. The church is a spiritual institution. And so we're not in the business of spending money to create a hiking trail around the property of the church. We're not in the business of creating a gymnasium so people can go work out. In fact, many of the religious organizations of our day are much more than religious organizations. They're involved in all kinds of ideas and all kinds of works. They also argued that human societies or organizations such as hospitals and publishing houses and colleges may provide services on a fee-for-service basis, but Scriptures do not allow for those to become permanent appendages to the church. In other words, the church does not support hospitals. We're not in the business of building hospitals. Now, it might be that we need to help a needy saint by giving them money or helping them pay their hospital bill. That's a fee-for-service thing. But we don't build hospitals. We don't operate hospitals. We don't build or operate nursing homes. We don't build or operate homes for unwed mothers and things of that nature. Nor do we build organizations to take care of orphans. Now, we may have members of a congregation who adopts orphans. It may be at some point they need help, and it would be perfectly legitimate to help that individual in what they're doing if they were in need. However, that's not the business of the church. That individual churches do not compose the universal church, as in a denominational structure, but that it is individuals who are the universal church. That was made by Brother Kevin rather plain in his talk yesterday, that the universal church is the whole of all Christians throughout the world. Every Christian in the world, wherever they may reside, they are a member of the universal church. Universal church is not made up of churches, not made up of congregations. It's made up of individuals. That there is no provision in the Scripture for the universal church to function. There's no way the universal church can function. It's a relationship of people rather than a structured organization. Now, these people who have married themselves to these organizations essentially are trying to make an organization out of the church itself, the universal church. And you can't do that. The human race, and to illustrate that, they said this: the human race exists, but it has no organizational structure. The human race lives and functions in nations which have an organizational structure. The universal church exists but it has no organizational structure. Its members function in local churches, which have an organizational structure. Each church has an organizational structure, and the members of the church, the members of that particular congregation, function within the framework of that congregation. And so this thing spiraled out of control to the point that churches divided, debates were held, preachers lost their jobs, they were fired. Many of them had meetings, their meetings were canceled. And it was all over the fact that these people who were pushing for the societies and pushing for the unscriptural ways of organization, and because of that, those who were conscientiously opposed, among whom was a fellow by the name of Roy Cogdell. Roy Cogdell was just one man of many. I chose his name to illustrate this because of the books that he's written. I want to call your attention tonight, especially young preachers or young men, to this little booklet by Roy Cogdell entitled Walking by Faith. I think there are several of them for sale out there on that table. If you don't have one, you need one. This is one of the great books ever written on this subject that we're talking about tonight. And it was written by Cogdell after he wrote the New Testament church. I think any young man who wants to preach ought to own both of them. I really do. And I think you need to read them and you need to study them and you need to come to understand them. But what about our own brethren? Where do we stand in this whole affair? I think we need to step up, as some old debaters used to say, to the lick log, and we need to actually take a look at ourselves. We've been guilty of this ourselves. And to deny it is to deny history. For example, in the 1940s, we had a mission work that was going on in the state of California. And various churches all over the country were encouraged to send money to Brother Carl Nichols. And he would put that money in a fund out in the state of California. And then he would write checks to various preachers who would go out there to preach. That was an organization larger than the local church. It was essentially a missionary fund. He paid these preachers a monthly salary out of a fund that had been sent by churches throughout the country. The churches lost their identity. When the preachers got their check, they didn't know where the money came from, because it merely had been put into a fund out there when it arrived. It essentially was a missionary society. That's all there is to it. It's a missionary society like the American Missionary Society, where churches sent money and then the society itself dispensed the money. In the January 1st, 1943 issue of the Old Paz Advocate, there is an article in there about the Oklahoma mission work. You were to send your money to Raymond Bray, who would receive funds from various churches and then pool that money into a fund, and various preachers would be paid for their services. Later on that year, a meeting was held at Sulphur by several brethren representing different churches where decisions would be made regarding mission work. That, of course, was a group larger than the local church. It was a group of brethren from several churches, and they would come together there and they would decide where the mission work would be held and who would do the preaching. In the state of Missouri, February of 1945, money on hand, according to N.C. Smith, was $560.42 for mission work in the state of Missouri. There was a list of churches that contributed to that fund, and the preachers who went there to work in that fund, Irvin Waters was one of them, and they were paid out of that fund. Well, our brethren soon realized that was wrong. And even though Brother Waters worked under that fund out in California for a period of time, he stopped. And he said, "Brethren, this is wrong. We don't have any authority for this, and we can't do it." When I was about 17 years of age, I went to Sulphur one year, and they had a meeting on Sunday afternoon of brethren from all over the state of Oklahoma. And they were going to decide who was going to hold the meeting next year at Sulphur. And Brother Waters stood up and said, "Brethren, this is an unscriptural meeting. We are a group of churches. This is not a single church. This is not a local church. As a group of churches, we don't have the right to make that decision. This is something the church at Sulphur needs to decide. After I moved to the state of Missouri, it was common up there once a year to have what we called a plan meeting. And various churches from the state of Missouri would come together, and they would decide who they were going to support and how much they were going to support. I honestly don't remember exactly how many of those meetings I attended, but I do remember very well the meeting at which I stood up and said, "Brethren, we're unscriptural. We're doing something here that's wrong. We have a gathering larger than the local church, and we don't have a right to make a decision about this." I think Richard Bunner was there, and I think Richard remembers that. And so we as a group of people have indulged in this sort of thing until we learn better. Now in Africa, we've had a lot of problems, especially with money. A number of years ago, all the preachers in Malawi, at least, were being supported. They were sending their money to one man. And after sending their money to this one man, he would then pay the preachers. Instead of the church sending directly to the preacher, they were sending through a man. Well, as a result of that, a little tract was published called "Mission Work Here and Everywhere. Shall We Follow the Bible Pattern or Go Digressive?" written by E.H. Miller, J. Irvin Waters, and Edwin Morris. And in these pages, I wish I could give you a copy of this tonight. This is the only copy I have left. Everybody needs to see it and everybody needs to read it, because it explains in detail what was wrong with the system that was being carried on in Africa. As a result of that, eventually that was changed, and the money was sent directly to the preachers rather than through somebody else, which was in harmony with New Testament practice. Of more recent occurrence, several years ago, a famine of some type occurred over there, and I have heard anywhere between $1 and $2 million was sent over there to the relief of those people. My home congregation notified them and said, "We'll gladly send money to any needy church if you'll just tell us who the needy church is and how we can get the money to them." And they said, "Well, we can't do that. You just send the money to us and we'll take care of everything else." We didn't send. We didn't send because we thought that was unscriptural, and I believe it was. You know, we have to be careful. I point an accusing finger at these people who created this division in the churches of Christ over the Herald of Truth and over other unscriptural arrangements. But we're just as wrong when we do it as anybody. And we need to be careful that we carry on the work of the church just like we try to carry on the worship of the church in harmony with what the New Testament reveals. One of the sad aspects of this whole situation is the fact that instead of people learning the truth and coming back to the truth, we continue to dilly-dally in things like this. We continue to assume more than we can support. We intend to back ourselves, for some reason, into a corner where we don't have enough money to pay the bills for what we want to do, and then we want somebody else to step in and help pay the bills. There's no example in the New Testament that anything like this ever happened among the churches of that day. Nor should it happen among us. If a church cannot support a work, then obviously the church can't do that work. It's just that simple. And it's wrong for us to create a situation where we're under obligation, and we know from the beginning we're under obligation to support something. We know we can't support it. Now that's how the sponsoring church arrangement came about in the first place. They wanted the work, they couldn't do the work, and so they said, "Tell you what we'll do. You send us the money, and then we'll take care of it." There's just as much said in the New Testament about how we carry on our evangelistic work and how we work together in doing that as there is in how we gather for worship. Now, I'm not trying to be critical of anybody. I really am thankful for the fact that over the past years, our brethren have recognized when they start down the wrong road and they stop and they come back and they try to do something about it. And I believe the brethren with whom I work will always do that. I really do. I believe brethren want to do what's right. They don't want to do what's wrong. They don't want to get into a situation that's wrong. Here's the problem. When you get into a situation that you can't support, first thing you know, you begin to try to find a way to make it work. And sometimes you're driven to select ways that are anti-scriptural, that are unscriptural, and we find ourselves in a worse condition than we ever realized.